Stalin sat in his office in the Kremlin, looking over papers about the latest grain shipments to Germany. Another trainload had crossed the border that very afternoon. Rubber, oil, valuable minerals. The supplies kept flowing, just as they had for almost 2 years since he and Hitler signed their agreement. Stalin lit his pipe, feeling satisfied. The Germans were getting everything they asked for, and the partnership seemed to be working perfectly. But 1,200 miles to the west, hidden along every inch of the Soviet border from the Baltic Sea down to the Black Sea, over 3 million German soldiers waited in the shadows. They hid in forests, behind hills, in secret staging areas just out of sight of Soviet guards. Thousands of tanks, countless artillery guns, thousands of aircraft. This was the largest invasion force ever gathered in all of human history, coiled like a spring and ready to strike. And there in Moscow, Stalin was reviewing grain shipments. The warnings had been pouring in for months from every direction, from every source imaginable. Richard Sorge, Stalin's brilliant spy operating in Tokyo, had sent over 80 separate intelligence reports with exact dates, exact numbers of divisions, exact invasion plans. Stalin scrawled across one report in red pencil, "You can send your source from the aviation headquarters of the German General Staff to his mother. He's not a source, but someone spreading lies." Churchill sent warnings through British intelligence channels. Stalin brushed them aside as tricks, attempts to create tension between him and Hitler. The British were desperate, he figured. They wanted the Soviets and Germans to destroy each other. Soviet border commanders sent increasingly desperate reports. German spy planes violated Soviet airspace every single day. Massive troop buildups were clearly visible across the border, artillery being moved into position. Stalin ordered them to stop panicking and forbade any aggressive response that might upset the Germans. On the night of June 21st, a German sergeant named Alfred Liskov abandoned his unit, crossed the border, and gave himself up to Soviet guards. He told them the invasion would begin at dawn, at exactly 3:15 in the morning. "The entire German army tomorrow," he said. The report reached Moscow. Stalin's response: "The deserter is probably a fake sent by German generals who want to start a conflict." Stalin went to bed that night completely confident in his thinking. Yes, there were some tensions with Germany. Yes, Hitler might make some demands. Perhaps he wanted more land, more resources. But Hitler was smart and practical. He was still fighting Britain. He wouldn't be foolish enough to fight on 2 fronts at once. The agreement would hold because it had to hold. Stalin had built his entire strategy around it. At 3:15 in the morning on June 22, 1941, the German artillery opened fire. Along an 1,800-mile front, thousands of guns fired at the same instant. The sound could be heard 50 miles away. The ground shook violently. The sky lit up with orange flashes that turned the darkness into flickering daylight. For 30 minutes straight, the bombardment continued without pause. Then the guns went silent, and 3 million men began moving forward. German bombers hit 66 Soviet airfields in the first few hours. Soviet aircraft, lined up neatly wing to wing on the ground as if on display, were destroyed right where they sat. Pilots rushed from their barracks to find their planes already burning. By noon, the Soviet Air Force in the western areas had basically stopped existing. 1,200 aircraft destroyed, most of them without ever taking off. The phone in Stalin's apartment rang at 4 in the morning. Defense Minister Semyon Timoshenko and Chief of Staff Georgy Zhukov were calling. The Germans had crossed the border. Multiple reports coming in. Artillery fire, ground forces advancing, airstrikes hitting cities. This wasn't some small incident. This was war. Stalin's first words. "Are you sure this isn't just some provocation by a few German generals?" Zhukov, trying to keep his voice calm, repeated the reports. The scale, the scope of it all. The entire border was under attack. Cities were being bombed. This was the invasion everyone had warned about. Stalin said nothing for several long seconds. Then he said, "Think it over," and hung up. For the next hour, while German tanks rolled deeper into Soviet territory, while Soviet units were being overrun, while communications broke down and chaos spread everywhere, Stalin tried desperately to reach the German embassy. He wanted to speak with Ambassador von der Schulenburg. Surely there had been some mistake. Surely Hitler didn't know about this. This must be unauthorized action by some Wehrmacht generals acting on their own. The embassy didn't answer. The ambassador was already on his way to the Kremlin with a message, but not the kind Stalin was hoping for. At 5:30 in the morning, von der Schulenburg was brought in to see Molotov, Stalin's foreign minister. The ambassador, looking deeply uncomfortable, read from a prepared statement. Germany was acting in self-defense against Soviet preparations for attack. The Reich could no longer tolerate the threat. A state of war now existed between the two nations. Molotov listened, his face showing no emotion whatsoever. When the ambassador finished, Molotov spoke quietly. "Do you believe that we deserved this?" The ambassador had no answer to give. Stalin arrived at his Kremlin office at 5:45. His inner circle was already waiting there. Molotov, Beria, Malenko, Timoshenko, Zhukov. They all stood when he walked in. Stalin went to his desk, sat down, and stared at the maps being spread out before him. Red arrows showing German breakthroughs. Already the arrows were pushing deep into Soviet territory. "What are our orders?" Timoshenko asked. Stalin seemed unable to concentrate. He kept coming back to the same questions over and over. Was this really Hitler's decision? Could this be some kind of provocation? Should they avoid a full response in case this was all just a misunderstanding? Zhukov, barely controlling his frustration, explained again. The massive scale of the attack made it absolutely clear this was planned months in advance. This was the invasion they'd been warned about. The invasion Stalin had refused to believe was coming. Stalin finally gave orders. Soviet forces were to defend themselves and counterattack where they could. But his language was careful, almost hesitant, as if he still couldn't quite accept what was really happening. By mid-morning, the situation had become absolutely catastrophic. German forces had pushed 10, 20, 30 miles deep in some areas. Soviet communications were falling apart. Entire units were being surrounded and cut off. The carefully planned defense lines existed only on paper. In reality, there was nothing but chaos and confusion. And Stalin, the dictator who controlled every single aspect of Soviet life, who had terrorized his way to total power, seemed completely paralyzed. At noon, the Soviet people finally heard official word of the invasion, but not from Stalin himself. Molotov gave the radio address instead. His voice, usually so cold and emotionless, carried a hint of feeling this time. Today, at 4 o'clock in the morning, without any declaration of war and without any claims being made on the Soviet Union, German troops attacked our country. He detailed the border violations, the bombing of cities, the unprovoked aggression. Then came the line that would echo through Soviet history. "Our cause is just. The enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours." But where was Stalin? The Soviet people waited desperately to hear from their leader, the man who had shaped their nation for over 10 years, who demanded complete loyalty from everyone, who presented himself as the father of the Soviet state. Where was he now, when the nation needed to hear his voice more than ever? Stalin remained silent. In his office, he continued receiving reports, each one worse than the one before. The Germans were advancing on multiple fronts at once. The city of Minsk was threatened. The Baltic states were being overrun. The southwestern front was in complete chaos. The German Air Force owned the skies. Soviet casualties were climbing into the tens of thousands and rising fast. Stalin's responses became increasingly wild and unpredictable. He gave orders, then immediately changed them. He demanded counterattacks, then forbade any aggressive action. He called commanders on the phone, screamed at them for retreating, then seemed unable to give any clear direction at all. The people around him watched with growing worry and fear. This was not the Stalin they knew. The decisive, ruthless leader had been replaced by someone who seemed lost, almost confused and bewildered. On June 28th, 6 days into the invasion, the situation reached a breaking point. Minsk had fallen to the Germans. The Western Front was collapsing completely. German tank divisions were racing toward the city of Smolensk. The true scale of the disaster was becoming clear to everyone. This wasn't just a temporary setback. This was a potential catastrophe that could destroy everything. Stalin visited the defense headquarters that afternoon. He found chaos everywhere, contradictory orders being given, no clear picture of where Soviet forces even were anymore. Communications with entire armies had been completely lost. He exploded in rage at the commanders, blamed them for everything that had gone wrong, and then seemed to deflate like a balloon. He left the building, got in his car, and gave an order that shocked his security guards. "Take me to the dacha." He went home, and he stayed there. For 2 full days, Stalin remained at his country house outside Moscow. He didn't go to the Kremlin. He didn't chair any meetings. He took very few phone calls. The Soviet Union was fighting for its very survival, and its leader had simply withdrawn from everything. What happened during those 2 days remains somewhat mysterious even today. Stalin himself never spoke about it in any detail, but people who saw him described a man gripped by deep depression and despair. He paced back and forth. He barely slept. He seemed, in the words of one person who was there, completely crushed. According to Nikita Khrushchev, who heard the story from others who witnessed it, Stalin said to those around him, "Lenin founded our state, and we've completely ruined it." It was an extraordinary thing to admit. Stalin, who never acknowledged being wrong about anything, who had built an entire cult around the idea that he was always right, was facing the possibility that his terrible mistake had doomed the Soviet Union to destruction. He had ignored every single warning that came his way. He had trusted Hitler when he shouldn't have. He had left the Red Army completely unprepared for war. He had killed or imprisoned the Army's most experienced commanders during his purges. He had been delivering resources to Germany right up until the very moment they invaded. And now German forces were racing toward Moscow itself, and there seemed to be almost nothing that could stop them from taking the capital. On June 30th, a group from the Politburo arrived at the dacha. Molotov, Beria, Malenkov, and several others. They found Stalin sitting in his study. When he saw them walk in, his face showed genuine fear. He thought they had come to arrest him, to blame him for the entire disaster, to remove him from power, and possibly execute him. "Why have you come?" he asked nervously. Molotov explained calmly. They needed him desperately. The country needed him. They were proposing the formation of a state defense committee with Stalin at its head, giving him complete authority over the entire war effort. But he had to come back. He had to lead the nation through this crisis. Stalin looked at them for a long, tense moment. Then he agreed to return. The next few days were spent carefully preparing. Stalin would address the nation directly, but it had to be done exactly right. The speech needed to acknowledge the terrible crisis they faced, while somehow rallying the people to keep fighting. It had to be honest about the danger, while still projecting confidence that victory would eventually come. On July 3, 1941, 11 full days after the invasion had begun, Stalin finally spoke to the Soviet people. His voice came over the radio at 6:45 in the evening. Millions of people gathered around radio receivers in apartments, factories, collective farms, military units all across the country. They had waited nearly 2 weeks to hear from their leader. Now, finally, he was speaking to them. "Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, men of our Army and Navy, I'm addressing you, my friends." The opening words were completely unprecedented and shocking. Stalin never used such informal, warm, friendly language. "Brothers and sisters, my friends." This wasn't the distant, godlike figure of Soviet propaganda. This was a man speaking directly to his people in their darkest hour of need. He acknowledged how serious the situation had become. The enemy had captured Lithuania, Latvia, and much of Belarusia. They were threatening Ukraine. Soviet forces had been forced to retreat. The danger facing them all was absolutely real. But then he began building the case for continued resistance. He reminded them of Napoleon's invasion over a century before, of how Russia had survived that catastrophe and eventually won. He explained that Hitler's armies, despite all their initial successes and victories, were not invincible supermen. They could be beaten. They would be beaten eventually. He outlined the strategy going forward. Partisan warfare behind German lines. Scorched earth tactics to leave nothing useful for the enemy. Burn the crops. Destroy the infrastructure. Make every single mile of occupied territory a complete nightmare for the invaders. In case of forced retreat, he said firmly, all equipment must be taken with us or destroyed. The enemy must not be left a single train engine, a single railway car, not a single pound of grain, or a single gallon of fuel. All valuable property, including metals, grain, and fuel that cannot be taken away, must be completely destroyed so the Germans cannot use it. He called for factories to immediately shift to producing weapons and military equipment, for civilians to dig anti-tank ditches and build fortifications everywhere, for every able-bodied person to contribute something to the defense of the motherland. And he framed the entire war in terms that would deeply resonate with everyone listening. This wasn't just about communism or the Soviet political system anymore. This was about the survival of the Russian people themselves, of all Soviet peoples living under German threat. This was the Great Patriotic War, deliberately echoing the Patriotic War fought against Napoleon's invasion. The issue is whether the peoples of the Soviet Union shall remain free or fall into complete slavery, he said with intensity. The Soviet people must realize this terrible truth and abandon all complacency and false comfort immediately. The speech lasted approximately 20 minutes from start to finish. When it ended, there was profound silence across the entire Soviet Union as millions of people absorbed and processed what they had just heard. Then, gradually but unmistakably, a shift began taking place in the national mood. The panic and terrible confusion of the previous 11 days began crystallizing and transforming into something quite different. Determination, anger, a will to resist no matter the cost. Stalin had finally found his voice after those 11 days of crushing silence, but it was noticeably different from before the invasion. The cult of personality around him remained intact, but something fundamental had changed in how he spoke. He had addressed the people almost as equals for once. He had acknowledged real danger rather than pretending everything was under control. He had made it deeply personal. Brothers and sisters. Those three words mattered enormously to people. They suggested shared struggle and shared sacrifice, not a distant leader simply commanding from high above, but someone in the fight, right alongside them, facing the same mortal danger. In the days and weeks that followed that broadcast, Stalin's transformation continued and deepened. He took direct personal control of the entire war effort through the State Defense Committee he now chaired. He met with military commanders daily, sometimes every single hour. He made decisions constantly, often absolutely brutal ones without hesitation. He ordered cities to be defended to the very last man standing. He authorized blocking detachments whose job was to shoot any soldiers caught, retreating without orders. He demanded counterattacks, even when everyone knew the cost in lives would be absolutely horrific and appalling. The paralysis and depression of late June was completely gone. Whether it was genuine psychological recovery or simply Stalin forcing himself to function through sheer willpower, he became the wartime leader the Soviet Union desperately needed in that moment. Ruthless, constantly demanding, completely unforgiving of any failure, but crucially present and deeply engaged with every aspect of the war. But he never forgot those first terrible days of the invasion. Never forgot all the warnings he had arrogantly ignored. Never forgot how close he had come to complete and utter disaster. In private conversations later in the war, He would sometimes reference the invasion and its beginning. "They deceived me," he said once to Averell Harriman, the American ambassador visiting Moscow. But that wasn't quite accurate or honest. He had deceived himself completely. He had desperately wanted to believe the non-aggression pact would hold firm. He had convinced himself that Hitler was rational and wouldn't risk fighting on two fronts simultaneously. That all the warnings were just British provocations designed to cause trouble. He had built an entire worldview and strategy around these comfortable assumptions, and when harsh reality violently shattered them all at once, he had briefly shattered as well, unable to function. The cost of that catastrophic miscalculation was almost beyond comprehension. In just the first 3 weeks of the German invasion, the Red Army lost over 400,000 men killed or captured. Thousands of tanks and aircraft destroyed, entire armies surrounded and annihilated. Territory containing millions of Soviet citizens was occupied by German forces. By December 1941, when the German advance finally ground to a halt before reaching Moscow, Soviet casualties numbered in the millions of dead, wounded, and captured. The occupied territories contained over 60 million people now living under brutal Nazi rule. The industrial heartland of Ukraine was lost. The city of Leningrad was under siege and slowly starving. The Soviet Union survived this onslaught, but just barely. And it survived only because the brutal Russian winter arrived early. Because German supply lines collapsed under the strain, because Hitler made his own serious strategic blunders in response, and because the Soviet people fought back with absolutely desperate courage, born of having no other choice. But it didn't have to be so terrifyingly close to total defeat. If Stalin had simply heeded the warnings pouring in from every source, if he had allowed the Red Army to properly prepare and position itself, if he hadn't ruthlessly purged the experienced officer corps beforehand, if he had accepted reality instead of clinging to his wishful analysis and comfortable assumptions, the disaster could have been prevented or at least greatly reduced. Those 11 days of terrible silence spoke volumes about what had happened to him psychologically. The man who demanded absolute control over everything, who never admitted being wrong about anything ever, had been confronted with the devastating consequences of his greatest mistake. And for 11 long days, he couldn't face his own people. When he finally did speak to them, he used words he had never used before in his entire political career. Brothers and sisters, my friends, words that acknowledged shared humanity, shared mortal peril, shared responsibility for what came next. It was the closest Stalin ever came to offering an apology. Not in the actual words themselves, but in the tone, in the admission that was implicit but perfectly clear to anyone listening carefully, that the situation was so dire specifically because leadership had failed terribly, that trust had been catastrophically misplaced, that the Soviet people were now paying an enormous price for decisions made in the Kremlin. "Our cause is just," Molotov had declared on June 22nd in that first radio address. "The enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours." It would take 4 more years of the most brutal warfare in human history. 27 million Soviet citizens dead, entire cities reduced to rubble, populations utterly devastated, an entire generation scarred forever by trauma. But Molotov's words eventually proved true. The enemy was defeated. Victory did come, though at a cost almost impossible for the human mind to fully comprehend. But on June 22nd, 1941, as Stalin sat in his office, desperately trying to understand how his careful calculations had gone so catastrophically and completely wrong, victory seemed not just difficult, but almost impossible to imagine. The pact he had trusted so completely lay in smoking ruins. The army he had purged of experienced leaders was collapsing on every front. The warnings he had dismissed so arrogantly had been accurate in every detail, and the nation he ruled with absolute authority was now looking to him for leadership and guidance in their hour of greatest need. For 11 days that felt like an eternity. He had no words at all to offer them. When he finally found the words, They were completely different words than anyone expected to hear from his mouth. Not the usual propaganda about Soviet invincibility, not the distant pronouncements of an untouchable dictator, but a direct appeal that was almost intimate in its tone, honestly acknowledging the terrible danger while demanding shared sacrifice from everyone. Brothers and sisters. In those three simple words, Stalin revealed more about his internal state than any amount of analysis or explanation could ever show. The man who had never seen himself as anyone's brother, who had murdered and terrorized his way to absolute power, who trusted absolutely no one and demanded complete obedience from everyone, was asking his people to stand with him now, not because he was commanding them to as their dictator, but because their mutual survival required it desperately. The invasion had shattered far more than just military plans and strategic assumptions. It had shattered Stalin's confidence in his own judgment and decision-making ability, and in that rare moment of psychological shattering, very briefly, he had spoken to his people as a fallible man rather than as an infallible god. It wouldn't last very long. Within a few months, the old cult of personality would reassert itself with full force. Stalin would once again become the distant, absolutely terrifying figure who ruled entirely through fear and intimidation. The propaganda machine would work overtime to portray him as the military genius who had always known everything, always planned perfectly, always controlled every outcome. But the people who heard that July 3rd broadcast and absorbed its meaning never quite forgot it completely. They remembered the tone, the specific words chosen, the sense that just for one brief moment, the vulnerable man behind the carefully constructed myth had been visible to them. What did Stalin say when Hitler broke their non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union with the largest army ever assembled? For 11 agonizing days, he said absolutely nothing at all to his people. And in that crushing silence, the Soviet Union very nearly died. When he finally did speak, he said, "Brothers and sisters." And in those words, he was asking his people to save him from the terrible consequences of his own catastrophic mistake. They did save him and their country at a cost that's almost impossible to fully comprehend or put into words. But they did it.